The Klingon female's eyes blazed with primal hunger as she cornered Paul Mason in the Jeffries tube. Her body trembled with barely contained desire, a biological imperative threatening to overwhelm her reason. Paul's heart raced, realizing he was face to face with an alien girl in heat who couldn't control herself. Alarms blared throughout the USS Intrepid, punctuated by the sounds of disruptor fire and shouted orders. The starship shuddered violently, caught in the unrelenting grip of a Klingon tractor beam. Paul, a human engineer, had been conducting routine maintenance on the warp core when chaos erupted. Captain Hernandez's voice crackled over the intercom, her tone grim. "All hands to battle stations. We are under attack by a Klingon warbird. Prepare for boarding action." Paul sprinted towards engineering, his mind racing through defensive protocols and containment procedures. The ship lurched again, and he stumbled against a bulkhead. The distinctive sound of transporters activating nearby told him the Klingons had already breached their defenses. As he rounded a corner, Paul found himself face to face with a group of Klingon warriors. Their bat'leths gleamed in the emergency lighting, and Paul knew he stood no chance against their superior strength and combat training. He backed away, searching for an escape route, when a disruptor blast sizzled past his ear. The Klingon warriors crumpled to the deck, stunned. Behind them stood a female Klingon, her disruptor still smoking. She grabbed Paul's arm with surprising strength and dragged him into a nearby Jeffries tube. "I am Pollux," she growled, her voice husky and strained. "I need your help, human." Paul's training took over, and he assessed the situation rapidly. The female Klingon's skin glistened with sweat, her breathing labored. Her eyes held a mix of desperation and barely contained lust. Pollux explained her predicament, each word seeming to cost her great effort. "I am experiencing Ponfar, a mating drive that affects Klingon females every 7 years. If I do not mate soon, I will die." Paul's eyes widened as the implications sank in. The Klingon boarding party wasn't just an act of aggression, it was a desperate attempt to find suitable mates. Their own males, Pollux revealed, had been decimated in a recent battle. "Human and Klingon biology is surprisingly compatible," Pollux continued, her hand still gripping Paul's arm. "I chose you because you are strong and clever. You can help me survive this and perhaps forge a new understanding between our people." Paul's mind raced. Helping Pollux could be seen as a betrayal of Starfleet, a violation of his oath and everything he stood for. Yet the possibility of gaining crucial intelligence on Klingon biology and potentially brokering a diplomatic breakthrough was tantalizing. The sounds of battle echoed through the ship's corridors. Paul knew he had to make a decision quickly. The fate of 2 lives and possibly 2 civilizations hung in the balance. As he looked into Pollux's fierce eyes, he saw not just an enemy, but a being in desperate need. In that moment, Paul realized that his choice could redefine the very nature of human-Klingon relations. With a deep breath, Paul prepared to make a decision that would change everything. The question was no longer about survival, but about seizing an unprecedented opportunity for peace, and perhaps something more. Paul's heart raced as he made his decision. With a nod, he grasped Pollux's hand and led her deeper into the Jeffries tube. "I'll help you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos surrounding them. They crawled through the narrow passages, Paul's knowledge of the ship's layout guiding them away from the sounds of battle. Pollux's labored breathing echoed in the confined space, her body radiating heat that Paul could feel even without touching her. As they emerged from a hatch, Paul's eyes darted around, assessing their surroundings. The corridor was empty, but the distant sounds of disruptor fire and shouted orders kept them on high alert. "This way!" Paul hissed, pulling Pollux towards a rarely used storage bay. Her grip on his arm was like iron, her desperation palpable. They reached the storage bay doors, and Paul's fingers flew over the control panel. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dimly lit room filled with crates and spare parts. Once inside, Paul sealed the entrance and disabled the internal sensors, his engineering expertise ensuring their privacy. Pollux stumbled into the room, her composure crumbling. She leaned against a stack of crates, her chest heaving. "Human?" she growled, her voice a mixture of pain and need. "We must hurry." Paul approached her cautiously, his mind racing. This was uncharted territory, not covered in any Starfleet manual. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it made contact with Pollux' arm. The touch seemed to ignite something within the Klingon female. With a primal roar, she grabbed Paul and spun him around, pinning him against the crates. Her strength was overwhelming, her body pressed against his with an urgency that both terrified and exhilarated him. Paul gasped as Pollux' teeth grazed his neck, her hands tearing at his uniform. He struggled to keep up, his human sensibilities clashing with the raw, animalistic nature of their encounter. As clothing fell away, Paul's eyes widened at the unfamiliar landscape of Klingon physiology. Pollux' skin was hot to the touch, covered in intricate ridges and patterns he had never seen before. He explored hesitantly, eliciting deep, guttural sounds from his alien partner. Their coupling was intense, bordering on violent. Pollux' strength was barely suppressed, and Paul found himself fighting to avoid injury. He gasped in pain as her nails dug into his back, drawing blood. Yet there was something undeniably thrilling about the encounter, a primal connection that transcended species and politics. As they moved together, Paul's mind flashed to the battle raging outside their secluded sanctuary. He thought of Captain Thorne fighting to defend the ship, unaware of the true nature of the Klingon attack. Guilt and uncertainty warred with the overwhelming sensations of the moment. In engineering, Sarah Holmes worked feverishly at her console, her face illuminated by the soft blue glow of the warp core. She frowned as she noticed an anomalous energy reading coming from the Klingon ship. "What the hell?" she muttered, her fingers flying over the controls. The energy signature was unlike anything she had seen before. As she analyzed the data, a plan began to form in her mind. If she could somehow use this unusual energy against the Klingons, they might have a chance to break free. Back in the storage bay, Paul and Pollux' encounter reached its climax. Pollux threw her head back, a roar of release echoing through the room. Paul collapsed against her, spent and gasping for air. As the haze of passion cleared, Pollux' eyes suddenly focused. The frenzy of Pon farr began to subside, replaced by a clarity that had been absent before. She looked at Paul, her expression a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. "Human," she said, her voice hoarse, "you have saved my life, and perhaps more." Paul sat up slowly, wincing at the various aches and bruises that were making themselves known. "What do you mean?" Pollux' eyes darted around the room, as if seeing it for the first time. "In my moment of clarity, I see now the folly of our attack. We were desperate, driven by biological imperative. But this could change everything." She leaned closer to Paul, her voice low and urgent. "Listen carefully. Our ship's shields are weakened on the port side. A concentrated phaser burst there could disable our tractor beam. And there are others like me, driven by Pon farr in the aft section of our vessel. They are vulnerable." Paul's mind raced with the implications of this information. If they could convey this to Captain Thorne and Chief Engineer Holmes, they might be able to end this conflict quickly and with minimal bloodshed. But as the adrenaline of their encounter faded, reality began to set in. Paul looked at Pollux, seeing not just an alien warrior, but a person who had shared something profound with him. "What happens now?" he asked softly. Pollux' expression hardened. "Now, we face the consequences of our actions. Your captain will see this as a betrayal. My commander will view me as weak for seeking help from an enemy." Paul nodded grimly. The sound of battle still echoed through the ship, a reminder of the precarious situation they were in. They had information that could save lives on both sides, but revealing it could cost them everything. As they began to dress, Paul's mind worked furiously, trying to formulate a plan. They needed to find a way to convey the critical information without inciting further violence or destroying the fragile understanding they had forged. Pollux finished fastening her armor, her movements precise and controlled once more. She looked at Paul, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions he couldn't fully decipher. "Are you ready, human?" Paul took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, reaching for the door controls. As the seal began to disengage, they prepared to step back into a world that had irrevocably changed for both of them. The storage bay door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the dimly lit corridor beyond. Paul and Pollux emerge cautiously, their senses heightened by the lingering adrenaline of their encounter and the ever-present sounds of battle echoing through the ship. Paul winced as he moved, his body bearing the marks of their intense coupling. Pollux, by contrast, seemed reinvigorated, her eyes clear and focused. The frenzy of Pon farr had subsided, replaced by a steely perseverance. "We need to reach the bridge," Paul whispered, his mind racing with the implications of the information Pollux had shared. "If we can get this intel to Captain Thorne, we might be able to end this conflict before more lives are lost." Pollux nodded, her hand instinctively moving to the disruptor at her hip. "Agreed. But we must move carefully. My people will see me as a traitor, and yours will view me as an enemy combatant." They crept through the corridors, ducking into alcoves and side passages whenever they heard approaching footsteps. The ship shuddered periodically, a reminder of the ongoing battle outside. As they rounded a corner, Paul nearly collided with a fallen crewman. The sight of the motionless body in a scorched uniform drove home the stakes of their mission. Suddenly, a guttural shout echoed down the hallway. "Pollux, show yourself, you dishonorable patak!" Paul and Pollux pressed themselves against the wall, their hearts racing. Around the corner strode Commander Koth, flanked by a group of Klingon warriors. Their bat-leths gleamed menacingly in the emergency lighting. Pollux's expression resolute, her eyes meeting Paul's in a silent exchange. With a subtle nod, she stepped out into the open, her head held high. Paul followed, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Commander Koth," Pollux said, her voice steady, "I can explain my actions." Koth's eyes narrowed, darting between Pollux and Paul. "Explain quickly, before I separate your head from your shoulders. Why do you consort with this human while your sisters fight and die?" Paul's mind raced, searching for a way to diffuse the situation. Before he could speak, Pollux stepped forward, her voice ringing with authority. "The High Council has led us into folly, Koth," she declared. "This attack was not born of honor or strategic necessity, but of desperation. Our females, driven mad by Pon farr, are being used as weapons. We risk war with the Federation to satisfy a biological imperative." Koth's expression flickered, a mix of anger and uncertainty crossing his features. The warriors behind him shifted uneasily, their grip on their weapons tightening. Paul saw an opening and seized it. "Commander," he said, addressing Koth directly, "there's a solution that doesn't require further bloodshed. We can use our transporters to beam the affected Klingon females directly to our medical bay. Our doctors can help manage their condition without the need for alternative measures." The proposal hung in the air, its implications rippling through the assembled Klingons. Koth's brow furrowed, the conflict evident in his eyes. Honor, duty, and the survival of his people warred within him. The tense silence was shattered by the arrival of a Starfleet security team, led by Lieutenant Commander Jack Rivera. Phasers raised, they formed a defensive line at the end of the corridor. "Stand down!" Rivera shouted, his finger poised on the trigger. Paul stepped between the two groups, his hands outstretched. "Wait! Everyone, please! We have a chance to end this peacefully." In quick, urgent tones, Paul explained the situation to Rivera. The Starfleet officer's skepticism was evident, but as the explanation unfolded, a glimmer of understanding appeared in his eyes. The standoff stretched on, neither side willing to lower their weapons. The future of two civilizations balanced on a knife's edge. Suddenly, Captain Thorne's voice crackled over the ship's intercom. "All hands, this is the captain. Cease fire immediately. I repeat, cease fire. We are initiating diplomatic negotiations with the Klingon forces." A collective exhalation seemed to ripple through both groups. Slowly, weapons lowered, though tension still hung thick in the air. Captain Thorne himself arrived moments later, accompanied by Dr. Elena Petrova and her medical team. The captain's eyes swept the scene, taking in the unlikely alliance before him. "It seems," Thorne said, his voice carefully neutral, "that we have much to discuss." As the two leaders began to converse, Paul felt a hand on his arm. He turned to find Pollux beside him, her expression unreadable. "What we've done," she said softly, "it changes everything, for both our peoples." Paul nodded, the weight of their actions settling on his shoulders. "We've opened a door," he replied. "What matters now is what we do with this opportunity." As they watched Captain Thorne and Commander Koth move towards the conference room, Paul and Pollux shared a moment of silent understanding. The battle might be over, but the true challenge was just beginning. They had forged an unexpected connection, one that could serve as a bridge between their species. But navigating the political minefield ahead would require all their skill, courage, and the fragile trust they had built. With a deep breath, Paul straightened his torn uniform. "Shall we?" he asked, gesturing towards the conference room. Pollux nodded, her warrior's stance softening slightly. "Indeed. It seems our journey together is a long way to go, Paul Mason." Side by side, the unlikely pair made their way towards the negotiations that would shape the future of human-Klingon relations. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and possibility in equal measure. But as they crossed the threshold into the conference room, both Paul and Pollux knew that they had already taken the first, crucial step towards a new era of understanding. As Paul and Pollux entered the conference room, the tension was palpable. Captain Thorne and Commander Koth sat at opposite ends of the long table, their postures rigid and eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Paul felt a twinge of nervousness as he took his seat, acutely aware of the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Captain Thorne cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Commander Koth, in light of recent developments, I believe we have an opportunity to perseverance this conflict peacefully." Koth's eyes narrowed. "Speak plainly, human. What do you propose?" As Thorne began to outline his thoughts, Paul found himself unconsciously leaning forward, his mind racing. He glanced at Pollux, who sat with perfect posture, her face an unreadable mask. Yet he could sense the subtle tension in her frame, the way her fingers twitched almost imperceptibly on the table's surface. The negotiations progressed, with both sides cautiously probing for common ground. Paul and Pollux found themselves repeatedly called upon to provide insight, their unique perspective bridging the gap between human and Klingon understanding. "If I may, Captain," Paul interjected during a lull in the discussion, "I believe our experience demonstrates the potential for cooperation between our species. We've seen firsthand how our differences can be complementary rather than divisive." Pollux nodded in agreement. "The human speaks truth, Commander. Our encounter has shown me that there is much our peoples could learn from one another." As the talks continued, the door slid open, admitting Dr. Elena Petrova. The chief medical officer's normally immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, her eyes bright with excitement. "Captain, Commander," she said, nodding to both leaders, "I've been analyzing the data from our initial scans of the affected Klingon females. The results are fascinating." Dr. Petrova activated a holographic display in the center of the table, showing complex molecular structures. Despite our obvious external differences, humans and Klingons share remarkable biological similarities at the cellular level. This could have profound implications for medical research, beneficial to both our species. Commander Koth leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Explain." As Dr. Petrova delved into the technical details, Paul noticed a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The earlier hostility was giving way to curiosity and cautious optimism. Suddenly, the ship's intercom crackled to life. "Bridge to Captain Thorne," came the urgent voice of Lieutenant Commander Rivera. "Sir, we're receiving a priority transmission from Chief Engineer Holmes. She says it's crucial to the negotiations." Thorne raised an eyebrow. "Put her through." Sarah Holmes's voice filled the room, tinged with excitement. "Captain, Commander, I've made a breakthrough with the electromagnetic pulse technology we were developing to counter the Klingon shields. I believe it could be adapted to help manage the symptoms of Pon farr in Klingon females." The revelation sent a ripple through the room. Paul watched as Koth's expression shifted from skepticism to guarded interest. "Furthermore," Holmes continued, "I propose a joint human-Klingon research project to refine this technology and develop a long-term solution. This could prevent future incidents and foster scientific collaboration between our peoples." The proposal hung in the air, its potential implications seeming to vibrate through the room. Paul held his breath, acutely aware of the historical moment unfolding before him. Captain Thorne broke the silence. "Commander Koth, as a gesture of goodwill, I offer the services of our medical bay to treat your affected crew members immediately. Dr. Petrova and her team can work alongside your medics to stabilize the patients while we discuss the details of this potential collaboration." Koth's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking between Thorne and Pollux. After a moment of tense silence, he gave a curt nod. "Agreed, but I will oversee the transfer personally." As the group moved to implement the plan, Paul found himself working alongside Sarah Holmes in engineering, modifying the transporter systems for safe transport of the Klingon females. The work was intricate and demanding, requiring all of his focus and expertise. In sickbay, Dr. Petrova and her team worked feverishly alongside Klingon medics, their initial wariness giving way to professional respect as they combined their knowledge to treat the patients. Pollux moved among them, her presence a bridge between the two cultures, helping to smooth over misunderstandings and facilitate communication. The atmosphere of cautious cooperation was shattered by a sudden alarm from one of the biobeds. "Doctor!" shouted a nurse. "Patient Kalar is going into shock." Paul, who had just entered sickbay to deliver a report, watched as Dr. Petrova and a Klingon medic raced to the convulsing patient's side. The monitors above the biobed flashed angry red warnings as Kalar's vital signs plummeted. "She's rejecting the treatment," Dr. Petrova said, her voice tense as her fingers flew over the controls. "We need to stabilize her immediately." The Klingon medic snarled in frustration. "Your human methods are killing her!" As the medical team fought to save Kalar's life, Paul felt the fragile peace they had built beginning to crumble. He looked at Pollux, seeing his own concern mirrored in her eyes. They had come so far, but now everything hung by a thread. In the chaos of the medical emergency, Paul realized that the outcome of this crisis would shape not just Kalar's fate, but the future of human-Klingon relations. As Dr. Petrova called for a new set of instruments, Paul stepped forward, determined to do whatever he could to help. The sickbay doors hissed open, admitting Captain Thorne and Commander Koth. Their expressions were grim as they took in the scene before them. Paul knew that the next few moments would be crucial. The path to peace, or renewed conflict, lay in their hands. The tense atmosphere in sickbay was suddenly shattered by the blaring of alarms. Captain Thorne's communicator chirped urgently. "Bridge to Captain Thorne," Lieutenant Commander Rivera's voice crackled through. "Sir, we've got a situation. A Klingon battlecruiser just dropped out of warp. It's the IKS Vorcha." Thorne's expression hardened. "On my way," he said, turning to Commander Koth. "It seems we have company." As they rushed to the bridge, Paul and Pollux exchanged worried glances. The fragile peace they had worked so hard to build was now under threat. The view screen on the bridge revealed the imposing silhouette of the Klingon vessel, its weapons clearly primed and ready. A transmission cut through the tense silence. "This is General Krang of the IKS Vorcha," a deep, gravelly voice boomed. "You will immediately return all Klingon personnel, including the affected females. Failure to comply will result in the destruction of both your vessel and that of the traitor Koth." Captain Thorne straightened his uniform. "This is Captain Thorne of the USS Intrepid. We're in the middle of delicate negotiations. Perhaps if you join us, we could—" "Silence, human," Krang interrupted. "You have 1 hour to meet my demands, or we open fire." The transmission cut off abruptly. Thorne turned to his crew, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Red alert! Shields up!" As klaxons blared and the ship's lighting shifted to a deep red, Paul's mind raced. They had come too far to let it all fall apart now. He stepped forward, an idea forming. "Captain," he said, "let me and Pollux beam over to the Vorcha. We can try to reason with General Krang, explain the situation." Pollux nodded in agreement. "It's risky, but it might be our best chance to avoid bloodshed." Thorne considered for a moment, then nodded. "Agreed, but we need to give you every advantage we can." He tapped his communicator. "Thorne to engineering. Lieutenant Holmes, I need you to modify 2 communicators with that prototype universal translator you've been working on." "Aye, sir," Sarah's voice replied. "I'll have them ready in 10 minutes. Dr. Petrova approached, holding a datapad. "Take this with you," she said, handing it to Paul. "It contains all the medical data on the treated Klingon females. If we can show General Krang the benefits of our cooperation, it might sway him." As Paul and Pollux prepared for their dangerous mission, Commander Koth received an encrypted message on his personal device. His eyes widened as he read it, then he quickly composed himself. "Captain," Koth said, his voice low, "I've received word from my contacts in the High Council. Krang's faction is losing power. The Council, they're interested in what we're doing here." Thorn raised an eyebrow. "That could be useful leverage. Use it carefully, Commander." Minutes later, Paul and Pollux materialized on the bridge of the EKS Vorcha, immediately surrounded by armed Klingon warriors. General Krang, a mountain of a Klingon with a face crisscrossed by battle scars, glowered at them. "What is the meaning of this human infestation on my bridge?" he growled. Pollux stepped forward, her posture proud and defiant. "General Krang, I am Pollux, daughter of Korbat. We come as envoys to explain the situation and prevent unnecessary conflict." Paul activated the modified communicator, allowing for more nuanced translation. He began to explain the medical breakthrough, the potential benefits for the Empire, and the honor found in their unexpected cooperation. As Paul spoke, he noticed Klingon engineers eyeing their communicators with barely concealed interest. He filed that observation away, sensing a potential bargaining chip. General Krang listened, his expression shifting from outright hostility to grudging interest as Paul presented the medical data. "You claim this human treatment can control the madness of Ponfar?" he asked, his tone skeptical but curious. "Not just control, General," Pollux interjected. "Manage it in a way that keeps our female warriors battle-ready. Imagine the tactical advantage that would give the Empire." Krang's eyes narrowed, considering the implications. However, his ingrained distrust of humans was not so easily overcome. "And why should we trust you, human? Your Federation is weak, concerned with lofty ideals instead of strength and honor." Before Paul could respond, his communicator chirped. "Intrepid to Mason," came Dr. Petrova's voice. "Lieutenant K'Elar is insisting on speaking with General Krang. She says it's crucial." Paul relayed the message, and after a moment of tense deliberation, Krang agreed to hear K'Elar's testimony. The Klingon female's voice, though weakened, rang with conviction as she described how the human treatment had saved her life and restored her honor as a warrior. K'Elar's words seemed to strike a chord with Krang. He paced the bridge, clearly wrestling with the decision before him. Finally, he turned to Paul and Pollux. "I will consider what you have said," Krang growled, "but I will not make such a momentous decision based solely on your words. The negotiations will continue here, on the Vorcha." Paul understood the implicit threat. They were now hostages, their lives guaranteeing the humans' cooperation. He shared a look with Pollux, seeing his own mix of apprehension and purpose mirrored in her eyes. "Agreed," Paul said, knowing they had little choice. He activated his communicator. "Captain Thorn, General Krang has agreed to continue negotiations, but on the Vorcha, he's requesting your presence along with Commander Koth and Dr. Petrova." There was a moment of silence before Thorn's voice came through. "Understood. We're on our way. And Paul, watch your backs over there." As they waited for the others to arrive, Paul and Pollux stood side by side on the Klingon bridge, acutely aware of the armed warriors surrounding them. The fate of two civilizations now rested on their shoulders, and the real challenge was only beginning to unfold. Paul took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. The tension on the Vorcha's bridge was palpable as Captain Thorn, Commander Koth, and Dr. Petrova materialized. General Krang's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the newcomers, his hand resting on the hilt of his Dik Tog. "You claim to have a medical breakthrough," Krang growled, addressing Dr. Petrova directly. "Prove it." Dr. Petrova stepped forward, her chin held high. "General, I propose a demonstration. Allow me to treat one of your affected females here, on your ship, under your supervision." Krang's lip curled in a sneer. "And risk the life of one of our warriors for your human experiments?" Before anyone could respond, a familiar voice crackled over the comm system. "This is Lieutenant K'Elar. I volunteer for the procedure. Paul watched as Krang's expression shifted from surprise to grudging respect. After a moment of consideration, he nodded curtly. Very well, but if any harm comes to her, your lives will be forfeit. The medical bay of the IKS Vorcha was a far cry from the sterile environment of the Intrepid. Klingon and human medical personnel worked side by side, their movements a careful dance of cooperation and wariness. Kalar lay on a biobed, her eyes fierce with grit despite her weakened state. As Dr. Petrova began the treatment, Paul noticed her brow furrowing in concentration. The doctor's hands moved with practiced precision, but he could see the strain in her movements. "Doctor?" Paul asked quietly. "The equipment," she muttered. "It's not fully compatible with our techniques. I need to modify the approach." Paul's mind raced, analyzing the problem. He turned to the Klingon medical officer nearby. "Your tissue regenerator, can it be recalibrated to emit a focused beam of delta radiation?" The Klingon's eyes widened in understanding. "Yes, but it would require reprogramming the emitter array." "I can do that," Paul said, already moving towards the device. His fingers flew over the controls, making rapid calculations and adjustments. As he worked, he overheard snippets of the tense negotiation unfolding nearby. Commander Koth's voice was low and urgent as he spoke to General Krang. "The High Council sees the potential in this alliance," Koth was saying. "Think of the strategic advantage, General. Our warriors, unencumbered by the limitations of Pon farr, would be unstoppable." Pollux chimed in, her voice steady and persuasive. "This is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. We adapt, we evolve, we conquer. Is that not the Klingon way?" Paul finished his modifications and handed the device to Dr. Petrova. She nodded gratefully, immediately putting it to use. Kalar's vital signs began to stabilize, the erratic spikes on the monitor smoothing out. Suddenly, the lights in the medical bay flickered. A low hum filled the air, growing in intensity. Paul's eyes darted to the power coupling connecting the human and Klingon equipment. Sparks erupted from the junction. "Power surge!" Paul shouted. "The systems are overloading." A Klingon engineer rushed forward, his hands moving to disconnect the equipment. Paul grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Wait! If we cut power now, we'll lose all progress. We need to stabilize the flow." The Klingon hesitated, then nodded. "What do you need, human?" "Your phase inverters," Paul said quickly. "If we can modulate the power input, we can create a stable interface." Together they worked feverishly, human ingenuity melding with Klingon technological prowess. The other Klingons watched in astonishment as the unlikely pair brought the systems back into alignment. As the crisis passed, Paul looked up to see General Krang studying him intently. There was a glimmer of something new in the Klingon's eyes, not quite respect, but perhaps a reluctant acknowledgement. Dr. Petrova's voice cut through the tension. "It's done. The treatment is complete." All eyes turned to Kalar as she sat up, her movement strong and fluid. She stood facing General Krang with fire in her eyes. "I stand before you, General, in full control of my faculties," Kalar declared. "My mind is clear, my body strong. This alliance has not weakened me. It has made me a more formidable warrior." A murmur ran through the assembled Klingons. Even Krang seemed taken aback by the dramatic transformation. Paul could see the general's commitment wavering, the possibility of cooperation beginning to take root. But before Krang could respond, a shrill alarm cut through the air. The ship's computer spoke in harsh Klingon, which Paul's modified communicator translated. "Alert! Romulan warbird decloaking. Weapons powered and targeting." In an instant, the medical bay erupted into action. Klingon warriors rushed to battle stations, while the Federation officers exchanged alarmed glances. The main view screen flickered to life, revealing the sharp features of a Romulan commander. "This is Praetor Karras of the Romulan Star Empire. Explain this gathering immediately, or prepare to be destroyed." Paul's mind raced, analyzing the situation. They were outgunned, caught between two hostile forces. But perhaps... He turned to Pollux, an idea forming. "The electromagnetic pulse technology," he said urgently. "If we combine it with Klingon disruptors..." Pollux's eyes widened in understanding. we could create a defense against the Romulan weapons. As they quickly outlined their plan to Captain Thorne and General Krang, Paul realized that this moment would define not just their immediate fate, but the future of interstellar relations. The Romulan warbird loomed on the monitor, its weapons charging. General Krang stood at the center of the bridge, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. In his hands lay the power to shape the course of history. As he opened his mouth to give his order, Paul held his breath, acutely aware that the next word spoken would determine the fate of not just those present, but potentially the entire quadrant. The Romulan warbird's weapons reached full charge, its intent clear. In the face of this new threat, the fragile alliance between humans and Klingons would either crumble or be forged into something unbreakable. The next few moments would reveal which path they would take. General Krang's eyes blazed with fierce willpower as he surveyed the tense faces around him. In that moment of crisis, with the Romulan warbird's weapons trained on them, he made his decision. "We fight together," Krang growled, his voice carrying across the bridge. "Humans, Klingons, to your stations. We will show these Romulan Patak the strength of our combined might." The bridge erupted into action. Klingon warriors moved with practiced efficiency, their hands flying over consoles. Paul found himself working alongside Chief Engineer Vorcha, their minds racing in tandem. "If we can integrate the Federation's shield harmonics with your cloaking matrix," Paul said, his fingers dancing across the alien controls, "we might be able to create a defense they've never seen before." Vorcha nodded, his ridged forehead furrowed in concentration. Yes. And if we modulate the frequency to match their weapon signature..." They worked furiously, human intuition meshing with Klingon technical expertise. Around them, the air crackled with energy, as power was rerouted and systems were pushed to their limits. On the monitor, the Romulan warbird loomed, its weapons reaching full charge. Paul held his breath as the first barrage of disruptor fire lanced out, striking their hastily constructed shields. For a heart-stopping moment, the ship shuddered. Then, miraculously, the shields held. A cheer went up from the Klingon crew, quickly silenced by General Krang's raised hand. On the screen, Praetor Karras's face twisted in confusion and frustration. "Impossible," the Romulan commander hissed. "What trickery is this? Since when do Klingons and humans fight as one?" Captain Thorne's voice came through the comm system, calm and measured. "Praetor Karras, this is Captain Thorne of the USS Intrepid. We request a moment to explain the situation." As Thorne began to outline the events that had led to this unlikely alliance, Paul watched the Romulan's face carefully. Karras's expression shifted from outright hostility to grudging curiosity. "A medical breakthrough, you say?" Karras interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "One that affects Vulcanoid biology?" Paul saw the wheels turning in the Praetor's mind. It was clear the Romulans had their own secrets, their own struggles with the more volatile aspects of their biology. Dr. Petrova stepped forward, her voice steady. "Praetor, I propose a demonstration. Allow me to beam aboard your vessel with a small team. We can show you firsthand the potential of this treatment." A tense silence fell over both bridges as Karras considered the offer. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, Doctor, but be warned. Any sign of treachery, and your lives are forfeit." Minutes later, Paul found himself materializing in the sterile confines of the Romulan warbird's medical bay. Beside him stood Dr. Petrova, Pollux, and Kava, a Klingon medical officer whose stoic expression betrayed no hint of unease in these alien surroundings. They were immediately surrounded by Romulan guards, their disruptor rifles trained on the newcomers. Paul raised his hands slowly, his eyes scanning the room. In a corner, partially obscured by a privacy screen, he noticed a Romulan officer lying on a biobed. The officer's face was contorted in pain, his body trembling with barely controlled spasms. Praetor Karras strode into the medical bay, his gaze sharp. "You claim to have a treatment that can help him?" he asked, gesturing toward the suffering officer. Dr. Petrova nodded, her professional demeanor unwavering. "Yes, Praetor. With your permission, we can begin immediately." As the doctor moved towards her patient, Paul and Kava set to work adapting their equipment to interface with Romulan technology. It was a delicate process, requiring all of their combined knowledge and ingenuity. The power coupling is incompatible, Kava growled in frustration. Paul's mind raced, analyzing the alien circuitry. What if we bypass the main conduit and route it through the secondary systems? The Klingon's eyes lit up with understanding. Together they worked to create a stable interface, their movements a dance of cooperation that would have been unthinkable mere days ago. Meanwhile, Pollux moved among the Romulans, her diplomatic skills put to the test as she explained the procedure and answered their wary questions. Her unique perspective as a bridge between cultures proved invaluable in easing tensions. As Dr. Petrova began the treatment, Paul held his breath. The success or failure of this moment could determine the future of interstellar relations. He watched as the Romulan officer's vital signs began to stabilize, the erratic spikes on the monitor smoothing out. Praetor Karras leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the readouts. "Remarkable," he murmured, almost to himself. When the treatment was complete, the Romulan officer sat up, his movements strong and controlled. He looked at Karras with clear eyes. "Praetor, I feel myself again. The fire in my blood has cooled." A murmur ran through the assembled Romulans. Karras turned to face the away team, his expression a complex mix of emotions. "It seems," he said slowly, "that we have much to discuss." Back on the bridge of the Vorcha, General Krang received an urgent communication from the Klingon High Council. As he listened to their directives, his face darkened. The Council demanded he secure any advanced technology or medical knowledge for the Empire's exclusive use. Krang's heart made as he considered his options. The potential for a historic agreement lay before them, but his duty to the Empire could not be ignored. For now, he decided, he would keep this information to himself. It could prove useful leverage in the negotiations to come. "Praetor Karras," Krang said, his voice carrying across the comm channel, "I propose we continue these discussions on neutral ground. There is an uninhabited planet nearby that would serve our purposes." As the three ships moved into orbit around the chosen world, Paul and Pollux found themselves preparing to beam down as part of the diplomatic team. They stood side by side in the transporter room, the weight of the moment heavy upon them. "Who would have thought," Pollux said softly, "that our path would lead us here?" Paul smiled, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Whatever happens down there, we've already achieved something remarkable." As the transporter beam began to energize, Paul's mind raced with the possibilities that lay ahead. The next few hours could reshape the balance of power in the quadrant, for better or worse. As they dematerialized, he steeled himself for the challenges to come, knowing that the true test of their newfound alliance was only beginning to take shape. As the transporter beam released them, Paul and Pollux found themselves on the surface of an alien world, a hastily assembled conference zone spread out before them in a clearing ringed by strange, twisting flora. Ace, Captain Thorne stepped forward, his weathered face set with grit as he addressed the assembled delegates. "We stand at a crossroads," he began, his voice carrying across the clearing. "The events of the past days have shown us the potential of cooperation between our peoples." Paul watched as the captain laid out the benefits of their accidental alliance, his words painting a picture of a future where shared knowledge could lead to unprecedented advancements. As Thorne spoke, Paul's eyes darted between the key players, gauging their reactions. General Krang stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mask of conflicting emotions. The Klingon leader's eyes betrayed his internal struggle, the pull of duty to his empire warring against the undeniable advantages of collaboration. When it was Krang's turn to speak, his voice rumbled with cautious support. "The Empire has always sought to expand its power," he growled. Perhaps there is strength to be found in limited joint ventures." Praetor Karras, the Romulan leader, listened with narrowed eyes, his fingers steepled before him. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and precise. "The potential benefits are intriguing," he admitted. "However, we must ensure the autonomy of our people is preserved. I propose a strictly regulated exchange program with clear boundaries and oversight." As the discussions progressed, Paul noticed a change come over Pollux. The Klingon woman's posture grew rigid, her breathing labored. With a start, Paul realized her Pon-farr symptoms were returning, likely triggered by the stress of the high-stakes negotiations. Pollux's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of panic and almost unchecked desire. She muttered a hurried excuse and strode away from the conference area, disappearing into the alien forest. Paul hesitated for a moment, torn between his duty to the negotiations and his concern for Pollux. Making a split-second decision, he followed her into the woods, the bioluminescent flora casting an otherworldly glow over the alien landscape. He found Pollux leaning against a tree, her forehead pressed against its smooth, glowing bark. Her entire body trembled with the effort of maintaining control. "Pollux," Paul said softly, approaching her with slow, deliberate steps. She whirled to face him, her eyes wild. "Stay back," she growled, her voice husky with need. I can't control it much longer." Paul continued his approach, his heart racing, but his movements calm and measured. "It's okay," he said, reaching out to her. "We've been through this before. Together." In the soft glow of the alien clearing, their eyes locked. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a growl that was equal parts frustration and desire, Pollux pulled Paul to her. Their kiss was fierce, a clash of human tenderness and Klingon passion. Paul's hands tangled in Pollux's hair as she pressed him against the bioluminescent tree, its light pulsing in rhythm with their racing hearts. As they gave in to their mutual attraction, the forest around them seemed to come alive. Glowing spores drifted through the air, settling on their skin like stardust. The alien flora swayed in a non-existent breeze, as if the entire ecosystem was attuned to their intimate dance. Meanwhile, back at the conference, the delicate balance of the negotiations was thrown into chaos. A junior Romulan officer, his face contorted in pain, suddenly collapsed to the ground. His body convulsed, racked by some unseen torment. Dr. Petrova rushed forward, her medical tricorder already whirring. "It's similar to what we saw with Pollux," she announced, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to act quickly." In a flurry of activity, Klingon and Romulan medical staff converged on the fallen officer. Under Dr. Petrova's guidance, they began to apply the techniques developed for Pollux's treatment. Captain Thorne, General Krang, and Praetor Karras watched in tense silence as the medical team worked. The fallen Romulan's vital signs, projected onto a hastily erected screen, began to stabilize. As the officer's eyes fluttered open, clear and focused, a collective sigh of relief swept through the gathering. Praetor Karras stepped forward, his face a mixture of amazement and cautious hope. "This," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "changes everything." The impromptu demonstration of cross-species medical cooperation became a turning point in the negotiations. As the leaders huddled together, their voices low and intense, the atmosphere of the conference shifted dramatically. It was into this changed landscape that Paul and Pollux returned, their hair slightly disheveled, but their eyes clear and focused. They found Captain Thorne, General Krang, and Praetor Karras gathered around a makeshift table, finalizing the details of what appeared to be a groundbreaking treaty. "Ah, perfect timing," Captain Thorne said, beckoning them over. "We were just discussing the need for individuals to oversee this new joint venture." Paul and Pollux exchanged a glance, sensing the weight of the moment. As they approached the table, General Krang fixed them with an appraising look. "Your unique experiences," the Klingon leader rumbled, "and the trust you've built with all our factions make you ideal candidates to lead this delicate alliance." Praetor Karras nodded in agreement. "We are proposing a joint research station in neutral space," he explained, "focused on medical and scientific cooperation, with strict protocols to protect our respective interests." Paul's mind raced with the implications. "And you want us to—" "To serve as co-directors," Captain Thorne finished, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "overseeing this unprecedented collaboration between our peoples." As the sun began to set on the alien world, casting long shadows across the clearing, the leaders put their signatures to the historic accord. Paul and Pollux stood together, watching as the USS Intrepid, IKS Vorcha, and Romulan Warbird broke orbit, each vessel heading back to their respective territories to report on the day's extraordinary events. In the gathering twilight, Paul turned to Pollux. The Klingon woman's face was bathed in the soft glow of the bioluminescent forest, her eyes reflecting the stars that were just beginning to appear in the alien sky. "So," Paul said, a hint of wonder in his voice, "co-directors of a joint Federation Klingon-Romulan research station. Not exactly how I thought this mission would end." Pollux let out a low chuckle, her hand finding his. "The path of a warrior is never predictable," she said, her voice warm, "but I can think of no one I'd rather walk it with." As they stood there on the threshold of a new era in galactic relations, Paul felt a sense of both excitement and trepidation. The challenges ahead were daunting, but the potential for what they could achieve was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The first stars of evening twinkled overhead, silent witnesses to the birth of this fragile alliance. As Paul and Pollux began to discuss the logistics of their new roles, the alien world around them pulsed with life, a fitting backdrop for the new chapter of galactic history that was about to unfold.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.